Eastern European security. I'm Tengiz Paladze, I'm senior fellow, excuse me, შეიძლება რამნერ გავაკეთოთ, რომ ჩემი ხმა არ მესმოდეს? ჩემი ხმა მესმის აქედან და ძალიან მიჭირს ლაპარაკი. Thank you, excuse me, we had some technical problems. So my name is Tengiz Paladze, I'm senior fellow at the European Center for International Political Economy, and I have pleasure and privilege to moderate today's session. Today we are discussing transatlantic relations and future of our common security. I think we all agree that threats and challenges on the both sides of Atlantic are interconnected. And today we are witnessing growing hybrid threats and deteriorating security environment in the transatlantic space, be it in NATO member countries, EU member countries, or beyond, like Black Sea, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. It's obvious that our values are challenged, and the persistent and ruthless assault of resurgent Russian authoritarian state always has come under strain with speed and scope that few of us fully comprehended. And that puts the future of liberal democracy in the world exactly where Russia and Mr. Putin wants, in doubt and on the defensive. Meanwhile, a month ago, we had quite significant events. NATO leaders met in Brussels and agreed 2030 ambitious agenda to strengthen their alliance. At the same time, EU adopted new strategy towards Russia, push back, constrain, and engage. We also had US-EU summit to discuss and end all rumors about disagreements between the EU and the United States and declining interest of America towards Europe. Question of our panel is, are those steps enough to strengthen transatlantic security? So I would say that today we have really outstanding distinguished speakers. First of all, let me introduce General Philip Breedlove. General, good afternoon. Our pleasure to have you among our speakers. General Breedlove, during 39 years of service, he had a variety of demanding command and staff positions, including Supreme Allied Commander and Commander of US European Forces. General is strategic planner and leader and talented communicator. He currently serves on the Georgia Technical University Advisory Board, not this Georgia, but in Atlanta. And he is also a member of Board of Directors of the Atlantic Council. My pleasure to introduce Mr. Thomas Petriček, the former Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic. Along with theoretical knowledge, he has unique practical experience and knowledge of NATO, EU, Eastern Partnership, our region, and he personally contributed a lot in development, elaboration and development, so many projects dedicated to strengthening transatlantic ties, strengthening Eastern Partnership, Black Sea programs, and now he's senior non-residential fellow at the Center of Global Political Economy at the Institute of International Relations in Prague. He was external lecturer of international political economy in the Charles University in Prague, and his research interests lie in the area of international political economy, new technologies and development, social resilience and global environment, politics and climate diplomacy. I think everything well. Mr. Indrek Kanik, International Center for Defense and Security from Estonia, also outstanding friends of Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, the person who has various governmental positions in area of defense and security. He was Minister of Defense, Security Policy Advisor to the President Tomas Ilves, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defense, and we're happy here among our speakers. My pleasure to introduce Tomasz Gijewski, Warsaw Institute. Yes. Thomas. He graduated from International Relations at the University of Lodz and postgraduate studies in the National Defense University in Warsaw. Graduated National Security Study Program at George Marshall European Center for Security Studies. For many years he serves as a diplomat, actively promoting Polish interest in North America. My pleasure to introduce Mr. Richard Youngs, a senior fellow in Democracy, Conflict and Governance Program based in Carnegie, Europe. He works in EU foreign policy and on issues of international democracy. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Warwick. Prior joining Carnegie in July, he was director of European think tank Friday. He had position of UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and he is author of number of books about global politics, European Union. Welcome, sir. It's our pleasure to see you among our speakers. And our last but not least speaker, Mr. Bruno Lette. I'm not sure if he's here. I can't see him. Bruno is the senior fellow of Security and Defense at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Brussels. He provides analysis and advice on trends and geopolitics and on international security and defense policy. He focuses primarily on the EU security and defense policy, NATO, and Central and Eastern Europe. And he is the person who contributed a lot to organize flagship conferences like Brussels Forum. So, as I already mentioned, we will start with the new transatlantic agenda in Eastern Europe. So my first question goes to General Bridle. Biden's new administration prominent slogan was "America is back." So recently we had important events: Biden-Putin meeting, J7 meeting, NATO Brussels summit. So what is your impression and assessment about transatlantic relations? Is America back, and is America back to his leadership position? General, please.
Well, first, thanks for putting this conference on, and thanks for having me. Frankly, it is wonderful to be among friends, and I see many friends on the list of participants and attendees. So thank you for allowing me to speak a bit. Is America back? Well, I would offer that America may not actually ever have left. Clearly, we as other nations went through a period of different leadership that had some different approaches, but the American people and the American Congress never lost contact with our friends and allies overseas. And I think that our militaries and all of those who are serious security thinkers were constant in their approach to each other across the Atlantic during this time. I do believe that in a certain way, with our most senior leadership, we have again returned to fostering a more cooperative transatlantic engagement. And I think that's important. I mean, in the Black Sea, specifically in our Eastern European partners, we have encountered even more turbulent times. I think that it was a good statement that NATO recently put out as they're looking at redoing their strategic concept. They said our security environment is more complex and unpredictable than ever before. A much more assertive Russia, more brutal forms of terrorism, ongoing instability, and the list goes on and on. And so we find ourselves challenged in ways even more than we have in the past. The recent military buildup around Ukraine and in the northern Black Sea region, and the forces that literally have been left behind. Certainly there's been a show of some removal, but the forces and capabilities and equipment that have been left behind to bring rapid pressure on Ukraine just highlights the kind of actions that this Russia we see now are taking in these spaces where so many friends at this conference are involved. Not to mention continued pressure in the hybrid war, now very specific attacks from hacker groups in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when you ask, are we back? Is America back? I would say that we are. And I would just emphasize a couple of thoughts that I think should center our thoughts for the future. First of all, we should never accept these actions from Russia. We should never accept the occupations, borderization, passportization, all of the things that are going on now. We need to continue in the public spaces in our Atlantic alliances and associations to stand against them and never, ever recognize them. We need to stand firm on nations' sovereign rights to choose their path into the future, who they associate with and how they associate in their futures. And then as I get off the stage, and thank you for the question, let me just put 3 thoughts out there that might be a part of the future conversation. First of all, with Georgia specifically, our current military engagements are beginning to wind down. We need to develop the next series of enduring military engagements between the United States and Georgia and between NATO and Georgia. We need to think seriously about what the NATO role is in the Black Sea. As we've seen the recent provocative actions by Russia with the British freedom of navigation maneuvers in Ukrainian sea space, we need to think about what NATO's role in the Black Sea is. And then finally, in the United States and in NATO, I believe, we need to think about what is next in our military engagement with Ukraine to help it be more able to defend itself. So thank you for a few minutes of opening remarks. Thank you for the question. I look forward to the Q&A from everyone afterwards.
Thank you, General, for your remarks. Definitely, what is next is the question we're all thinking about, and American leadership in this regard is more than important. It's really crucial, and I'm pretty sure that we will back to the question about the Black Sea, how make Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and frontier democracies more defensible and protect their democratic development. So now let me move to Europe, to our European colleagues, and I would like to ask Mr. Thomas Petriček how European countries see current state of transatlantic relationship. The same question I have with Indrek. EU-US summit joint statement towards renewed transatlantic relationship highlight that US and the EU will join efforts to build a more democratic, peaceful, and secure world. And that both parties are committed to uphold the rules-based international order. So the question is how?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I would express probably the feeling of Europeans since last autumn, which was filled with expectations and which I believe, represents opportunities to engage with the new American administration. At the same time, I would call for cautiousness, not to inflate expectations. Because as it was said, there will be probably different style of relationship between Europe and US. It will be more cooperative, probably more predictable. It would certainly enclose also issues that haven't been emphasized over the past 4 years. At the same time, I think that we shouldn't ask the question what America back will bring to us, but we all should ask what can we do as partners, what we can do. We are not a group of squabbling kids any longer, and Europeans need to contribute more seriously in terms of security and in terms of tackling global challenges we are facing together with our transatlantic partners. I would conclude by stressing that our relationship with the United States will be also multidimensional, more dimensional than it used to be during the Trump's administration, probably. And we are not going to probably return back, but we need to think how to build a new transatlantic cooperation and partnership with continuous focus on security, where we need to invest in our security. We need to bring the resources also to help our partners, especially in our eastern neighborhood, to strengthen their security and to build up social resilience towards external threats, especially the new kinds of threats like cyber, hybrid, and so on. At the same time, I believe that the Biden's administration will seek cooperation with Europeans on rebuilding the international system. When US is ready to return, for example, to WHO, it doesn't mean that we are going to return to the organization which failed at the beginning of the pandemic. We need better organizations. We need better and more effective international system and rules-based order. And that is our common task and our common ambition. And we need to also be ready to work with other like-minded countries. And here I believe that even small countries like Georgia, Czech Republic, and others can bring a niche activity, niche ambition. At the same time, I think that compared to the past 4 years, we need to be ready for a debate among partners on values, on democracy, on human rights, on issues that usually connected us. And here I feel that it is also our homework, especially us from Eastern Europe or Central and Eastern Europe, that we cannot afford a backsliding on democratic principles. If we are to face a narrative from authoritarian regimes like Russia, like China, it is not by compromising on our principles. In contrary, it is on building strong state, in promoting rule of law, good governance, and human rights. And last but not least, I would like to stress that we need to understand the context in which the transatlantic relationship will be renewed. We need to acknowledge that a larger and larger portion of American attention is paid to the Indo-Pacific, and we need to be also ready to contribute together with the United States to tackling challenges that are probably not at the top of the priorities, like in the Middle East, North Africa, or Africa, where us can bring our own capacities to provide stability and to build a better place for all of us. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm interested in green issues, climate diplomacy. Certainly, these issues will be on the agenda, and our countries should be ready to actively engage in this kind of debate, as we are probably not the front runners in topics like climate change, green transition, but these provide an opportunities for countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Poland, or others, because we can contribute to bringing United States to the practical level of cooperation with the region. And I think that the connectivity will be another topic. We have seen recently the introduction of globally connected Europe, G7 outcomes. United States are stressing that they are going to continue with the Three Seas initiative, and here I believe is a big opportunity for our Eastern partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Definitely, cooperation and connectivity, a new project, new initiative. This is the way how we have to solve existing problem and move forward. And I also totally share your attitudes towards our values, because our cooperation is based on common values, and that's why EU exists and NATO exists. Now let me move to Inruk. You are from the country who knows what does it mean Russian threats and hybrid technologies. And actually, when we're talking about frontier countries, usually we mean Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, because you are now in NATO and EU. But sometimes I feel that when we're talking about frontier countries, you are also a frontier country. So are you satisfied with current status of transatlantic relations? And do you think that that's enough to develop agenda which will ensure long-lasting stability in our region?
Thank you for inviting me. First of all, I'm pretty happy about current situation and current in transatlantic relations. I think it's in much better shape than it was a year ago. And there is definitely a trust again between EU and the United States. And that's not good only for EU and the United States, but also for our partners and our neighbors like Ukraine, Moldova, and Ukraine, and Georgia. Of course, as Tomas said, we should approach this matter with some sort of caution. The differences remain, at least in few areas. If we're talking about trade, for example, TTIP was never easy, even during Obama administration, and I don't expect it to be very easy also under Biden administration. Defense spending is another area of possible differences between the United States and European partners. We have to give President Trump some credit here. Because of his pressure, there was an improvement in European NATO member states, but it was relatively slow, and in post-COVID-19 environment, there is a tendency to slow even further in this area. Thirdly, China and Russia. Several big European nations are much softer on China and Russia than the United States. But at least now we have a normal dialogue in this matter, and I think compromises between allies are on the table, and we can negotiate and find common ways to go forward in these matters. When we look at the point of view of security, then of course for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, probably the security is the most important area of the cooperation between US and the European nations. Especially now when we look at the Zapad exercises coming up in next month, and this is obviously a period of great threat for nations bordering Russia. But Baltic security situation has improved quite a lot since 2014. Enhanced forward presence in the Baltic countries has brought some sort of stability and security, and I think even common understanding of the people in the street is much more relaxed now than it was immediately after Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. But when we as a NATO countries can be relatively relaxed concerning Russian exercises this time around, the situation is much more nervous in Ukraine and also Georgia and Moldova. There is a new government coming up in Moldova. It's pretty obvious Russians don't like it. They have they have possibilities if they want to destabilize Moldova, for example, using Gagauzia is one of the options. They can also go on and start to arrange problems from the territory of Transnistria. So they have plenty of options over there. With Ukraine, as it was mentioned earlier, Russian exercises during the spring of this year were really close to starting new level of escalation. It was stopped, but we don't know for how long, because I don't see that Russia has achieved its goals in Ukraine, because if you look at the development of Ukraine, then in the longer term, it's definitely against what Russia perceives to be their interest. So there are big threats coming up. And also in Georgia, I think what we saw a couple of weeks ago in the streets of Tbilisi, I would be surprised if there will be no Russian hand in those events. I would also like to mention China. I think the perception of China in the United States changed during the late years of President Obama administration. And the main reason it was China's own behavior. President Xi Jinping, he took a very different approach to his predecessors. It was much more aggressive, it was much more arrogant, and this led to this change of attitudes in the US, and a few years later, 4 or 5 years later, in Europe as well. For example, in Estonia, the big wake-up call was when we realized, I think in 2018, that there is a real danger of our 5G networks to be built on Chinese technology. And since that, I think Estonian society started to understand much better what the threats China is posing for Europe. I understand that today China is probably not as big issue as for us, for Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, because Chinese investment is important, etc. But even in the medium perspective, things could change. The US sees, and rightly so, China as its own and also the free world's main competitor, and expects its allies and friends to be more or less on the same page in relationship towards China. So I would guess that you have to be very careful here in Georgia, for example, when you're looking at different Chinese investments, especially in the strategic fields, like infrastructure or telecommunications. So that's from my point of view to start.
Thank you so much. Absolutely agree. That's extremely important. Be very careful when it comes to critical infrastructure. And I also think that it's also extremely important, our cooperation when it comes to critical infrastructure. Because when we're talking about the development of new projects, connectivity of this region, new initiatives, be it Black Sea or trans-regional cooperation, it's extremely important to have engagement of our Western partners. But I think we will have opportunity to discuss these issues a little bit later. Thank you so much. And now I see Bruno Lette is with us. Bruno, good afternoon. I'm so glad to see you. Before the NATO summit, I remember German Marshall Foundation published extremely important report about transatlantic relationship and trends and the future of NATO. And this report covers not only member states, but covers also partners and aspirant countries. So what is your assessment about current relationship in transatlantic and security environment of aspirant countries? Please.
Hi, Tengiz, and well, pleasure is mine to see you as well and everyone in the room. And I apologize for being slightly late. I got a little bit confused about time zones, but I think the most important thing is that we're all together in a hybrid format. You know, as you rightly pointed out, Tengiz, the German Marshall Fund has, you know, been traditionally very active in the region, and we really care about the Black Sea, you know, as a topic for our programming and engagement, and we certainly will remain active in the future as well. So you asked me to comment a little bit on today's topic. Given that I'm here in Brussels, let me perhaps put that hat on and talk from this perspective. I mean, both the EU and NATO, I think the region has only increased in terms of priority and how policymakers here are considering it. We see that we look at the region from two perspectives. I would say first, as a security environment, and there, of course, the role of Russia is of great concern to EU and NATO. But I also think that increasingly the region is being approached from an economic perspective as well. And there, it was already mentioned before, I think there's some concern on what role China plays there with countries that have a partnership with EU and with NATO. So I think these are two dimensions now that we need to look at. Tengiz, I just want to make sure you hear me well, because I have a tremendous echo on the line.
Yes,
Hello?
Oswald. Yes.
Yeah, okay, you hear me well. Okay, that's okay. I hear myself twice and double. That's okay. So maybe 3 or 4 very short points. When we look at how the region is now being approached here in Brussels, what hits me actually right now is how the importance of focus, the importance of reforms is now on the agenda. When you talk to folks around here in Brussels, in town, reforms is ever increasingly on top of the policy agenda. And that's not only from a EU perspective, but also from a NATO perspective. That both institutions are really taking this more and more seriously and put it on top of what cooperation with the region should be. I also think that Europe has now found an ally in the United States when it comes to focusing on reforms. The Biden administration has put that also several times on top of the agenda. I mean, I just recall the visit of the US State Secretary to Kiev a few months ago, where reforms was kind of the key message. So I think this has to be taken quite seriously, because in European capitals and in Washington, reforms is definitely a key topic that needs to be considered. 2, of course, deterrence remains a big issue as well. Deterrence in the Black Sea regions. Just recently there was a big sea breeze exercise there. So I think that's definitely there. After a few years of perhaps being a little bit behind on the agenda, the Black Sea, finally institutions in Brussels have understood that the Black Sea is an area of priority, more than ever before. The way, I guess, the strategy here, I think, is more about avoiding incidents and risk management, I would say, while doing deterrence. I think those are 2 pillars of how the security is being addressed in the Black Sea region. Now, beyond that, maybe one final comment, and then we can dig a bit deeper into this topic. What concerns me the most about EU and NATO approaches to the Black Sea region, and maybe my assessment is debatable, but I'm most concerned about the internal unity of Europeans and also NATO when it comes to Black Sea approach. We still see, and we have to be honest about that not all countries think alike when it comes to the importance of the Black Sea as a region where we need to increase efforts and be present. The regional approach of the EU and the NATO are still flowed by member states that think differently. And this is simply a reality that we have to consider. We shouldn't be just, dreaming, telling fairy tales about that. So I think this is definitely something that we also need to take into consideration when we assess our approach, especially for countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. But let me perhaps stop here for now, Tengiz, and I'll happy to take some questions.
Very much, Bruno. Honestly speaking, I also share your concern, because the question about unified approach, this is what our society, not only in Georgia, but in Eastern Partnership countries people are concerning about, because when it comes to the strategy and vision and policy, we need a unified voice. Otherwise, we will have only some actions, but not strategy. So thank you for that. And back to question about strategy and vision, let me move towards Poland. And even century ago, Marshal Pilsudski had a vision about this region. His concept of intermarium was very important at that time. So, Tomasz, how do you see the current state of security in Central and Eastern Europe, considering that nearby your borders are conflict zones, and where is intermarium now?
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank organizers for invitation and organizing this important event. I have an honor to represent Warsaw Institute, which is one of the leading regional think tanks dealing with international security and building strong ties in Central Europe. And I would like to first say a few words about Georgia, as we are here in Batumi. Poland invariably remains the advocate of sovereign and territorially integrated Georgia. Moreover, Poland is perhaps one of the most vocal advocates of Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Georgia has been a part of European culture for centuries. Don't forget about this, ladies and gentlemen. And no one has the right to influence the process of Tbilisi's integration with the EU and NATO structures, like Mr. Bradlov said in the beginning. As Poland followed the similar path 3 decades ago, it is natural that it is ready to share its experience in implementing reforms and moving closer to the EU and NATO, and it does. This is why the recent visit of the President of the Republic of Poland, Mr. Andrzej Duda, to Georgia with the celebration of the 30th anniversary of regaining independence, May 26-27 this year. The President of Poland was the only foreign head of state invited to these ceremonies, so it clearly shows Georgia's attitude towards Poland, but also the esteem that Poland enjoys in Georgia. During his visit, Mr. President was on the border between Georgia and Tchinvali. I don't know if I'm correctly spelling this. Tchinvali district, the so-called ABL administrative boundary lines. And this is important in the context of Poland's chairmanship in OSCE in 2020. The situation in the occupied territories of Georgia will clearly be high on the agenda of the Polish presidency in the work of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, Poland strives at the EU and NATO forum to present a more specific offer and the so-called roadmap for Georgia. Poland consistently advocates the the continuation of the open door policy in the context of NATO 2030 process. Poland was also a subject of last NATO summit in Brussels on June 14th this year. And although I agree with most of my predecessors that this is very important to provide transparent and full rule of law within the administration of new members of NATO and EU. And thank you very much for a great discussion before the meeting in this regard, Thomas, as well. However, and the more democracy, the better for both the country and stability in Europe. The more democracy, the less authoritarian and aggressive and corrupting influence of certain countries is. However, this support for democracy, although it is a good direction, no one bear in mind it should be put in a cultural context of a certain country. And as we are talking about this, it should be introduced in a sensitive way, because we could achieve the contrary effect, like antagonizing the society and putting it back from the desired direction. And this is great that today's statement underlined the importance of this Euro-Atlantic integration path for the three countries, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. So I hope that this is one of the great news from today's conference, and let's build on that.
Thank you so much. Definitely, I agree that relationship between Georgia and Poland, it's really strong and firm, and we always appreciate the support we have from the Polish side. Now let me move to the Brussels, to Richard. Good afternoon, Richard. And let me ask you about your impression about the situation in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Partnership countries. Considering all the threats and challenges what we have here, and actually we have a plethora of challenges, starting with military threats and ending with cybersecurity, disinformation, propaganda, and so on, so on. So, and the always question is that, of course, security matters, but especially it matters when we are talking about countries who experience violation of their territorial integrity and their security in their day-to-day life. Then the people suffering to protect their statehood. So how can we ensure their security, and how new transatlantic agenda will respond to those hybrid threats? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, and apologies I can't be with you. So several colleagues have mentioned the importance of reforms of democratic norms in their relationship to security, and I think that this is one of the issues that's becoming more and more prominent on the new transatlantic agenda. It's one of the primary issues that the new US administration, the EU have agreed to work on together. The situation regarding democratic norms is fairly fragile, not only in the Eastern Partnership, but also in the EU states themselves. I think that's the first very important point to bear in mind, that the need to defend democratic values from hybrid influence operations it represents an existential threat today for EU states. So this is an internal challenge as well as an external challenge in terms of the EU's foreign and security policies in the three frontier states. My impression is that EU governments have intensified their efforts a lot, I mean, really dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years, to defend their own democratic norms from outside interference. There's a whole raft of policy initiatives that have been introduced. There's the European Democracy Action Plan that is now being developed, and quite an important advance in this area of work. My impression is that most European governments are giving a lot of priority to this issue internally. They're not attaching quite the same degree of priority to it externally. So I think that's the first issue, whether the EU is getting the balance right between its internal and external democracy challenges. Having said that, it is clear that the EU in particular has done a lot to support democratic reforms and the resilience of democratic institutions over recent years. So the EU has pumped a lot of money into this area. It's very well aware of the strategic importance of the democracy agenda. To my mind, because so much has already been done, I think the issue is how the EU fine-tunes its democracy support to maximize its contribution to the kind of security issues that this panel has been discussing. I think this for me is a really, really important issue to bear in mind. On this panel, we've been talking a lot about the security track that obviously is the NATO focus. The democracy agenda is more the focus of the EU, and to my mind, it's vitally important that the democracy agenda and the security agenda talk to each other much more smoothly and much more systematically than they have done in the past. If it's the case that the EU is supporting democracy, not just because it's normatively beneficial, but because it really understands this as a pivotal point in its strategic policy in the Eastern Partnership. Some effort has been made to improve coordination between NATO and the EU, between security and democracy policy, but I think a lot more could be done. I think tactically there are issues the EU could do better. I'll just make a few very, very brief suggestions. I think the EU could do a lot more on security sector reform. NATO brings the issue of security capacities to the table, but equally important is the need for strong democratic accountability over security forces within the Eastern Partnership countries. The EU's done some work on this, but not nearly as much work on security sector reform in the 3 Eastern Partnership countries as it has done elsewhere in the world, interestingly. So I think that's an area where the EU could step up. I think the EU is going to need a clearer policy on conditionality. Supporting democracy is not just about pumping in money when reform is going in the right direction. It's about knowing how to respond when things are not going in the right direction. We've seen this with sensitive developments and tragic developments in Georgia over the last couple of weeks. The EU has used some democracy-related conditionality or corruption-related conditionality in Ukraine and Moldova, but perhaps been a little bit ad hoc in the way it uses that. So I do think as these sensitive issues come to the fore, the EU will need a clearer position on conditionality. I think it's true that the EU needs to be very nuanced and careful on this because this can backfire. But because the political challenges are so acute, I think this is an area where the EU needs to improve its policy. And then finally, I think the EU needs a better way of reaching out to society. The EU is very, very good at reaching out and supporting certain areas of civil society, organized civil society, big NGOs in the 3 countries. It's less good at reaching out to the kind of broader protest mobilizations we've seen in the 3 countries over the last several years. These mobilizations are becoming more important. They're becoming more important to the democratic dynamics in the region. At the moment, the EU doesn't have a particularly good policy template to reach out to these kinds of areas. Where the EU has been good is positioning itself as a kind of mediating power. This is good. We've seen the results of this in Georgia, to a lesser extent also in Ukraine and in other places as well. But I think the EU still does need to make this quite difficult step from being a good mediator to making sure these mediated deals actually work to the benefit of democratic reform. So the Michel Agreement includes a lot of detail in this to make sure that the mediated agreement does unlock a whole range of democracy reforms. But we all know that the implementation is still a little bit in the air, a little bit uncertain. So I think that's a big challenge the EU has to follow through. But I think my final and kind of overarching observation would be the democracy agenda is important. It is going to be difficult, and it's one that affects EU states just as much as the 3 Eastern Partnership states. So I don't think this democracy agenda anymore is about the EU kind of exporting its own perfectly functioning democratic model to the Eastern Partnership. It's about reform actors, reform-oriented actors getting together in the EU and in the Eastern Partnership to work together where elites, where governments, where executives are behaving in rather illiberal ways.
Thank you, Richard. Absolutely, reforms and democracy is the backbone of our development and our statehood, because without democracy, there is no statehood, at least the statehood we are dreaming about, and no security, because security, we need to protect our values, our democracy, our state institutions. But let me back to the question of associated countries. Just a few minutes ago, we are eyewitnesses of really historical momentum when 3 presidents, President of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, signed joint declaration and established so-called associated trio, which is really extremely important to those countries to support each other, share their experience, and together work and join efforts towards their Western integration. At the same time, quite often I heard question why people and taxpayers in the EU should care about security and stability, be it Ukraine or Georgia or in Moldova. That's obvious that Georgians, Ukrainians, Moldovans, they consider themselves and they are Europeans and they see their future in European Union. But the question is why those countries and this region matters to the EU, to the Nato. So let me ask this question, Thomas. I think you will take this question, and I also interesting in opinion of other our speakers. Thomas, please.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I would like to applaud to 3 countries signing the memorandum and strengthening the cooperation because the European Union has called on our Eastern partners to work on a regional basis more, to help each other in terms of speeding up alignment with European regulations, in speeding up integration with the EU. On your question, I would probably return back to what has been present in most of the discussions, that what we really need now, and with Biden administration also focusing on the issue of values, is to have shining examples of democracy working in this world that has been very often presented that is not favorable for democracies, where strong authoritarian narrative is presented to be the future for mankind, with China, Russia, and other authoritarian regimes trying to also to persuade our audience, our citizens, that the future lies in centralized authoritarian countries that are better equipped for the future, which I would say no, it is not the future for us. And success of Georgia, success of Ukraine will certainly strengthen the standing of democracy in the world. And I think it is a process that benefits both sides. Spending money on helping Georgia to speed up economic development and to strengthen its security and resilience is investment in our own security and our own prosperity. That's why I'm glad that Europe, or European Union has waken up and seems to come up with much more robust investment plans which will benefit the citizens of countries in the Black Sea region in the Eastern Partnership.
Thanks so much. Absolutely, I agree that cooperation must be beneficial for both sides. At the same time, those countries try to develop not only political cooperation but economic cooperation and develop regional projects, ensuring east-west connectivity and cooperation. At the same time, European Union develops very interesting projects which is supported by the US. I'm talking about 3 Seas initiatives. However, we are in the Black Sea, and those Black Sea countries are not part of this project. So can we somehow merge our efforts and think about such kind of project beyond the European Union?
Well, I think it's a very good idea to merge these projects or to invite other Black Sea countries which are not so far part of the Free Seas initiative to join it. There have been discussions, at least I know, about Ukraine joining it. I'm not familiar whether Georgia has been discussed as well, but I think most of the nations who are currently part of Free Seas initiative would love to see Georgia, Ukraine and Moldova to join this initiative. it includes many countries from the Baltic Sea to Adriatic and Black Sea. So I don't see really any reasons why EU couldn't be part of it. At the moment, yes, it's mainly EU countries are part of it, but it's a decision to make for current member states. And of course, there has been discussion also about Germany joining this initiative. They are not full members of it either at the moment. So in my perspective, I would love to see that development.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
That you have discussed, the joining of these three nations together, as well as the 3 Seas initiative, because in my mind, what we need first and foremost is demonstrations of our unity, that we are together on issues like this, so that when Russia looks to its West, it sees unity of purpose and unity of action, and that is the greatest deterrence I think we'll have into the future. So these kinds of initiatives which show that unity will be very important. And I echo some of the remarks about shared responsibility and growing our ability to defend ourselves and focusing on those values like democracy, rule of law, that are important to all of us.
Thank you. If I may add something. And yes, of course, I agree that 3C initiative has perspective for even enlargement in the future, but it has to speed up, in my opinion. And I'm glad that the US is on board still with US new administration. But at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, we were discussing very theoretically about cooperation and security and within EU and NATO, but we have to also talk about facts, about processes. And I would like to mention the infamous Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a perfect example of lack of cooperation within NATO and within EU, because this project is definitely against the energy security of many NATO countries and also countries whose representatives were today in Batumi. So, and this project is supported by NATO states, as you know, having the green light from current US administration, unfortunately, in my opinion. But of course, I understand that there is a larger agenda, and hopefully we will be able to, let's say, strengthen the national security of eastern flank of NATO, and not only energy security, but also real national security in the eastern countries of NATO. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I ask a question to Bruno and Richard, let me back to General Breedlove. General, you are more than any other aware about number of initiatives about Black Sea cooperation, Black Sea security, and our efforts United States and other countries. But all those, almost all those, not all, but almost all initiatives about cooperation failed because of Russia. And what we see today, we see militarization of the Black Sea and attempt to make new dividing line in the Black Sea and close the Black Sea for the international cooperation. In this situation, I think this question goes beyond the EU, and it requires very strong American leadership. How you see situation and development in the Black Sea, and what do you think about the future strategy of defensibility of countries who are so committed towards Euro-Atlantic security, contributed a lot, but still not enjoying privilege to be covered under Article 5?
So I think this is one of those sad things we say, good news and bad news. Let's just all acknowledge the bad news at first. As I talked about before, I think Russia, more than anything, wants to ruin join the unity of Western alliances and associations. If they can find cracks in NATO, find cracks in the EU, and expand those cracks and try to minimize the authority, capability, and power of those organizations, that's exactly what they want to do. And I think they find opportunity in the Black Sea in these great friends and occasionally allies that live around the Black Sea region. And you're right, in the past, NATO has been fairly soft on what Russia is doing in the Black Sea region. But that's the bad news. The good news is I think you see these attitudes are changing. The United States has been doing freedom of navigation exercises for some time in the Black Sea. But now we see other great maritime nations like the UK joining in these freedom of navigation exercises, in using Ukrainian waters around the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. And this is important that other nations are joining. What we need to see is further, I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, further NATO work where other NATO nations are involved in these kinds of actions in the Black Sea. Other good news, we see some nations like Romania really stepping up to bring capabilities to this region. So may I just say, it's hard for to believe this from a military person, but there is not really a military solution, I think, in the Black Sea. It has to be diplomatic. But that diplomatic solution starts from all of the nations of the Black Sea stepping up to the responsibility for the demilitarization of this area. And I think there's opportunity here. I really believe that a great nation like Turkey could lead a NATO Black Sea fleet, and we could bring good pressure to freedom of navigation and freedom of commerce in this area, in the air and on the water. So good news, bad news. I see this as a place where we have opportunity, and we see some NATO nations now stepping up.
Thank you so much, General. Let me ask Richard. You mentioned democracy, you mentioned society, and definitely that's more than important. And definitely, if we are talking about Europeization of our countries, first of all, this is our society and functioning democracy. At the same time, the message we quite often heard from Russia propaganda, that countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, they are abandoned. And despite of some attempts and even sacrifices from those countries, I mean, Russians always try to deliver a message that nobody gonna to take them on the board when it comes to EU membership or NATO membership. Of course, somehow it affects on public mood. At the same time, Russia tries to portray itself as a defender of so-called conservative and traditional values, marginalized the West, and challenge liberal order. What we can do together to not only to react, but prevent such kind of threats?
External actors can solve all these democracy problems. They can work at the margins. I think that obviously there needs to be a lot of coordination. I think the EU's reluctance to offer membership perspectives will prove to be an historic mistake. Sadly, it doesn't look as if that situation is going to change anytime soon. In fact, I think the kind of strategic precariousness of the region has actually made more member states cautious on the membership perspective. I think that's very, very unfortunate, but there's still a lot that can be done to add kind of democratic resilience to institutions in the three countries. But as I mentioned in my opening presentation, I do think the EU and the US as well kind of need to change the way they do democracy support in a fairly far-reaching and qualitative way. The point you make about conservative values, obviously the tragic events in Georgia over the last couple of months have shown just how sensitive and present this is. There should be room for such conservative values in well-functioning democratic states. Advocating these kind of values should not be a pretext for illiberal political behavior or kind of quasi-authoritarian behavior. And that's what's happening in many countries around the world. In Eastern Europe, in the EU, and elsewhere, it's becoming a more potent trend. And I think a big challenge is to try and prize these two things apart. One thing, are quite legitimate conservative social values, whether one agrees or does not agree with those, they have a justified place within civil society, within democracy. Another thing is authoritarian politics, and the former should not be allowed to justify the former. And the EU's got itself into a muddle on this and has a challenge in the member states we know about. And this is beginning to affect the Eastern Partnership as well. So I think that is a really big challenge where the democracy agenda needs to be able to speak better to these kinds of values in the future. And I think the upcoming Biden Democracy Summit will provide a really good opportunity to foreground those kind of issues and give a prominent place to the three countries we're talking about here.
Thank you so much. Definitely, it's so important to strengthen resilience of society and support democratic institutions. Bruno, the question to you. You know those countries, you know society in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova. You know perceptions, stereotypes, and my question is, what we can do together to not only strengthen cooperation and strengthen integration, but also bring, let's say, European policy culture in those countries. I remember that when President Charles Michel was engaged in political crisis in Georgia, he always mentioned that the most important is the national issues of national interest. And polarization gives benefit only to those who are interested in dividing society. And it brings kind of black and white paradigm, which very easy to operate to those who are interested in weaken those countries and prove that, you know, Georgia or Ukraine or Moldova are just headaches for the European Union and they are failed state. So what we can do to overcome this challenge?
Thank you very much for this question, Tengiz, and you're absolutely right to point at that. And it's definitely also a favorite thing to do from Russian media like RT to portray countries such as Moldova, Ukraine, or Georgia that you are not part of the European culture, and which is of course not true. I've been, fortunate to travel many times to Georgia and other countries around the Black Sea, and I'm always amazed actually how similar our cultures are. Now, but how to actually fight this type of disinformation? Look, I think we need to acknowledge that countries like Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia have a hard time to win the hearts and the minds in EU and NATO member states. So definitely, I think it's important for the countries that we're talking about to keep investing in strategic communications and to really develop a strong public diplomacy abroad. Make sure that your governmental communications is coordinated, not only at home, but also with the countries that you're aiming better diplomatic relationships with. One of the things, for instance, that is very important in my opinion is that we should not only talk about expectations that Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova have, because often here in Brussels we hear about expectations of these countries, but you should also talk about your achievements. I think, focusing your communications on achievements is very important. What is your narrative? What is Georgia's narrative? What is Ukraine's narrative? What is Moldova's narrative when you communicate with NATO, when you communicate with EU? These are things that we need to think about. It's so important to keep stressing how successfully these countries are actually transforming. And how actually, this transformation is in line with expectations from Europe, from NATO. So, comms is very important, and not just from a diplomatic perspective. We, especially Georgia here, have done a tremendous job. Other countries too, Ukraine and Moldova as well, on cultural activities. For instance, we, being here, living here in Brussels, I think that I can go dozens of times a year to concerts and exhibitions and art expos from the countries we're talking about, and it might not seem relevant, from a first perspective, but actually it is, because it creates this mindset as well among citizens and populations of Western countries that the countries we're talking about are part of the European culture. And last but not least, there, Tengiz, I think one more thing. There is simply a number of countries in Europe. We need to admit that there is a number of countries in Europe that believe that if we engage with Russia and we open our hand, we reach out to Moscow, that Moscow will do the same. With the benevolent mindset, with good intentions. And the countries that have this impression, they persist in this misunderstanding. They persist in this failed strategy where they think if we engage, Russia will do the same back to us. I think it's important to stress to these countries, and we probably all know who we're talking about, that engagement with Russia, it's not because you reach out to them that they will reach out back to you. Actually, we see exactly the opposite. Each time we show a sort of weakness or open-heartedness, Russia is taking this for its own advantage. So this is also part of what we need to stress to these capitals, that it's not in the interest, to show weakness.
Yes.
Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you. Also, I would like to thank Bruno for a very sensible approach to this matter. And I would like to underline that every European country, both in EU and NATO, and also countries outside the two Euro-Atlantic structures, will benefit from the development of democracy, as this will strengthen and increase the zone of peace and freedom. Tengiz, you asked why Georgia matters, because it is another element in the puzzle of European stability and peace. So let's build it up on this. A democratic state, of course, also means greater economic development and an increase in the prosperity of the population. The goal should be to build the zone of democracy and freedom in Eastern Europe and in Southern one, even if it is outside of the EU and NATO. But you mentioned before as well a very important thing, Tengiz, I think it was you, that sometimes the enemies of democracy in Europe are using this argument that there is a tendency of implementing one model of democracy everywhere. We know that it is not, let's say, so easy. And although the fight with organized crime, with corruption is a certain thing, when we are going deeper into different, let's say, suggestions of changing culturally, offer of transformations, cultural transformation of countries in the Eastern and Southern Europe, we have to realize that there is this risk of using this argument against integration of these countries to the West. And Russia is using this argument. Putin, who talks about the rotten West and the fact that only Moscow can be an effective defender of traditional values, as you mentioned. So I think we have to be sensitive in this area, and we should not just assume that, for instance, new countries in EU or NATO cannot have good solutions for all the for the whole community, Euro-Atlantic community. Whether those solutions can be national security, like immigration, let's say, solutions for allowing legal immigration to be talked and discussed in the European Union, and not as it was a few years ago when illegal immigration caused dramatic problems for many countries in the community. So I think this is an important that we need to talk like we are talking today, and try to just reach the best approach, right? Sensible approach, which will be good for Euro-Atlantic security zone.
Thank you, and thank you, Bruno. Definitely, I mean, we were talking a lot about Russia, and I mean, this is reality, and Russia opposed integration of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova in Western alliance. But what about to think how to make our policy proactive, not just reactive, because quite often we're witnessing our reaction on Russia's action, but we are not leading agenda. So what we can do together, Eastern Partnership Summit is ahead. Thomas, what do you think in the situation when the EU is not ready for political marriage and for political commitment? What we can do to develop practical deliverables? Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, those countries are benefit with visa-free, DCFTA, association agreement. So what could be done or should be done to make the EU more visible?
I would agree that there is no political commitment. I think that we heard 1.5 hours ago a strong political commitment from the President of the European Council towards Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine. However, it's true that we are probably in a situation, and let's be honest, that Eastern Partnership has a big problem. There are 3 countries very much devoted to the European integration path, and you have 3 countries that have different priorities, also different strategic orientation. First of all, we need to differentiate. If we are to really meet the expectations of our partners, and especially the people in the region, we need to start differentiating and bring more where there is more will. And I believe, even though I do not fully agree with Richard Young on the issue that we haven't supported, for example, the democracy, or that we are missing this external dimension of democracy support, we need to certainly do more on resilience. Even though we have tried as a European Union to do something over the past 2 years to incorporate resilient support in our programs towards the Eastern partners. And I believe that we need to also figure out how we can speed up economic integration of the region. We have a good legal framework. We have DCFTA with the 3 countries. At the same time, I think there is much more what can be practically delivered by the European Union in terms of building infrastructure. As long as there will be no European flag on highways in the region, I'm afraid it will be hard to explain where the money goes from the European Union. And I'm speaking from the perspective of a country that have benefited a lot, like Poland and others, because we always have a big infrastructure project that has the European flag next to it. And I think it will be very important today, and that's why I mentioned the connectivity as a topic for upcoming period, with EU leading together with the US on bringing the countries closer in terms of transport, digital infrastructure, energy infrastructure, closer to the
Thanks so much. Inrik, in 90s, before you joined EU and NATO, I remember there were so many skeptics about Estonian and Baltic states' integration in EU and NATO. Even I remember there were discussions, do we need NATO anymore or not? However, if we compare situation you had 20 years ago and Georgia has right now, or Ukraine has right now, we have more friends who can advocate our interests. We're always talking about window of opportunity, but we shouldn't expect that somebody will grant you window of opportunity. How we can craft this window? How we can create this opportunity?
Well, I'm pretty sure that this window of opportunity will arrive one day. I don't know whether it will be in 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years' time, but it will arrive. Like for us, when we were occupied in 1940, it took 50 years to wait for window of opportunity to regain independence. But this window of opportunity came. And we don't know when Putin's regime comes to an end, but it will happen one day. And this is probably one of the windows of opportunity for Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova to become EU members as well. What you can do before that is, it's been mentioned many times, you have to be ready from the rule of the law point of view. I think the anti-corruption point of view. I think it's going to be very difficult for those nations who are currently very skeptical about those countries joining EU or NATO to say that, no, we are not going to accept you if everything is in order at home, for example. And that was the main reason why, let's be honest, Germans, French were very skeptical about us as well. And basically for the same reasons you have, how Russia feels about that. But we were quite well prepared, and at one point they had no option to say that, well, we have to accept them. And I think it has worked quite well since then. Just to mention, the Russian narrative was mentioned here as well, that you are not part of Europe and they are not waiting for you. Russians told exactly the same to us in the 1990s. And sometimes even now, on the very few occasions when we have direct contacts with Russians, they are telling that now you are second-class citizens in Europe. So that's very, very, very normal what they're doing. They have done this kind of information operations or influence operations for a very long time. I think, yes, rule of the law, independence, judiciary, and the fight against corruption are the most important things what you have to be ready at the moment, where you have to be ready at the moment when the window of opportunity arrives.
Thanks so much. Yeah, definitely. Russians were not happy when you became a member of NATO. However, I think that Russia got a benefit from your membership because they received stable, reliable partners, functioning democracy, state institutions, and before the Crimea, Russia has fantastic relationship with both NATO and EU member countries, and even developing military cooperation. So when it comes to the rumors that Georgia's NATO membership or Ukraine's NATO membership is threat for Russia, frankly speaking, I can't realize why it could be considered as a threat. General, this is a question towards you. Do you think that NATO's enlargement is the real threat to Russia?
So I certainly don't think it's the threat that they believe it is towards Russia. I have said more than once that the most important thing we need to talk about when it comes to enlargement is that sovereign nations need to be allowed to make sovereign decisions. If a nation wants to be aligned with the East, so be it. If a nation wants to be aligned with the West, so be it. No nation then enjoys a veto on that. And as we see, Russia has been using the invade and occupy veto to keep nations out of the West. And this is something that we as Western nations, EU and NATO, should stand against. I also would just like to remark, I hear this word often bantered around, or people often remark about how NATO has sort of enraged Russia with its enlargement. During my time as the SACEUR, we only had 28 nations. And the debates raged at every meeting at the military level, the foreign defense ministers level, the presidential level, the defense ministers level, at the dinners, which were much more unscripted. The discussion of the open door policy would always happen. And I watched how amazingly hard it is for nations to get into NATO. There is this impression out in the world that NATO's out there grabbing nations and pulling them in to antagonize Russia. That's the farthest from the truth. It's really hard for a nation to get through the process when they want to become a part of NATO. And so this concept of NATO enlargement is something that is antagonizing Russia to me is just not applicable, having watched it myself. And I'll just close with saying one more time. Sovereign nations have a sovereign right to associate the way that they want to. And we should not allow any nation to use some sort of veto over that right.
Thank you so much, dear General. And I see we have some comments and questions from our distinguished audience. And I also encourage all who has comments or questions to ask. And we have almost 3 questions from Rebecca Harm about democracy and connectivity. Rebecca, please. Okay, it seems to me that
does it work?
Yeah.
So, greetings to Batumi, and thanks for this, I would say, very interesting panel. So my first question goes to Richard Young. He spoke about experiences we made with the conditionality applied in some cases, so in Moldova and also in Ukraine, on different occasions, and that we have to develop this idea of conditionality, and I would like to understand it better, because what I remember is that cutting the countries off of the macro-financial assistance has major consequences, and sometimes not the impact you want to achieve. So my second question is in this context related to Georgia. So I'm following the discussion after the recent events on the streets of Georgia and also the death of a journalist in Tbilisi. So many citizens in Georgia are really asking the EU to apply kind of sanctions and are talking about conditionality. But what are the existing instruments of the EU or also United States to react in such circumstances? And my third point was not a question, it was more remark about integration. I see not the huge breakthrough, but a lot of opportunities for integration coming along with the EU Green Deal if the three countries are able to use this EU Green Deal offers in a very strategic way. It would also give them opportunities to be much more visible in the international climate debate in the United Nations.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Richard, please. And I also encouraged our other panelists who wants to respond to those questions. Richard, please.
Yeah, I agree with Rebecca. It's a good question. I think the issue of conditionality is a very delicate one. She's right that sometimes it can backfire. I'm not a particularly enthusiastic supporter of the EU using sanctions too zealously or too frequently. The academic evidence suggests they only work in very particular contexts where they dovetail with a particular momentum of national level democratic pressure. But I do think there are moments when political events will cross a red line, and the EU does need a more systematically elaborated policy of when some degree of conditionality may be appropriate. It may not be cutting off aid completely, although I do think the 4 or 5 occasions where the EU has temporarily held back macroeconomic assistance to Ukraine has actually helped propel some kinds of anti-corruption reforms on very, very specific issues. But I think if we do look at the tragic events over the last couple of weeks in Georgia, it seems to me the EU needs a kind of template for knowing when it is going to react with certain measures when these controversial events happen. If it's to have actually some kind of tangible way of responding, and it doesn't get ridiculed then for simply expressing concern about these really, really tragic kinds of events and then not having any kind of concrete policy response.
Yes, please. Thank you.
I would like to briefly react to the comment. I fully agree with Rebecca that for the three countries, the Green Deal represents a huge opportunity. Europe is going to be carbon neutral by 2050, probably even earlier, if the climate change will take the speed that we cannot predict. And we will need to get rid of our dependence on fossil fuels, which will also have a geopolitical context. But for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, being part of the green transition represents a potential to develop new sectors of their economies, bringing it closer, for example, to internal energy market of the European Union, and be part of the development of sectors like hydrogen, mobility, and so on. So I believe this is an opportunity. It can also strengthen your international standing, because it's not going to be the EU-only topic. With the new US administration, we will have more and more strategic alignment on this global challenge between both partners. And at the end of the day, we need to be also sure that our partners, our associated partners, will not be harmed by some of the proposals that are on the table. For example, carbon adjustment mechanism that might influence or have impact on imports from other countries.
Yes, please.
Just a very short remark. And being enthusiastic about the Green Deal is an excellent opportunity to find new friends in Germany and France as well.
Exactly.
Thanks so much. General, would you like to add your comments?
Oh, actually, I agree with what has been said.
Okay. Thanks so much. Actually, I think that also it's very important engagement of the EU in the processes developing in those countries, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, as well as in other Eastern Partnership countries. President Michel visited Armenia, Azerbaijan. He was personally engaged in the processes in Georgia, and I think this is the kind of positive power we are experiencing from the EU. And this is the most important because the leverage EU has, it's not only in a negative and repression way, but it's also in a way how you can engage. Because actually war is, that's my impression, war is really need society of Eastern Partnership countries to see that EU is interested in ongoing processes and EU is engaged deeply in those processes. So I think such kind of engagement and such kind of cooperation will help to overcome any crisis, because crisis can happen everywhere. The main problem is how you find effective solution. Don't you agree?
Absolutely, and I think President Michel really deserves credit for his efforts here in this part of the world. Just one more thing. I'm not a great fan of Twitter diplomacy, and even if you have problems among the friends, then it's much better to talk in privacy about the problems, and in this case it's much easier for your colleagues to accept diplomatic compromises as well. But if you are going public criticizing them, that leads to polarization without no doubt.
Absolutely agree, and I think that actually polarization is the problem not for only those countries. The polarization and populism now that we see across the Europe. Bruno, how is the situation from the Brussels? How do you see the development of the processes? I mean, development of cooperation between societies.
I apologize. Could you repeat the question? I didn't hear this one.
How do you see the development of processes in our societies, and how you see cooperation of societies, people-to-people contact? How we can encourage and what we can do more to make this cooperation between society more visible and more strong, and make our societies more resilient?
Well, you know, it's an interesting question. Obviously, you know, EU and NATO have a series of tools and instruments that enhance cooperation between societies. I mean, just think about something like Erasmus, for instance, which is a program to exchange students. You know, I guess for countries like Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova, it's just a matter of understanding what is out there in terms of tools and instruments at the heart of the EU and NATO, and using these to their most efficiency. Now, we're not only talking about institutions, of course, you know, it's also at the member state level. Again, you know, you were talking about proactive politics just 10 minutes ago, Tengiz, and you know, I think what's important to understand, you know, I think it's the countries that we talk about, you know, you should not, or we should not be just waiting to be offered things. You know, I think countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova should not be afraid to make active proposals. Also, you know, to propose policy programs, propose initiatives in various sectors. You know, you are countries that can do that. You have a wealth of ideas. You have a wealth of you know, of people that can initiate such initiatives. So ask, propose, understand what is out there in the institutional environment, but also at member state level. And I guess if we succeed to do that, the society-to-society contacts can only improve.
Thanks so much. I think we are already about to finish our discussion, but before, I would like to give time for the final conclusion to each of you. Your impression, your proposal, your advice, your expectation. Tomasz, please.
I'm honored to be always the first in the round. I would stress that we have a lot of opportunities right now with the new administration and topics that the new administration endorsed, it can bring an opportunity to renew the relationship between US, Europe, and associated partners. And I would also stress that we need to be also ready to put ourselves into American shoes. We very often expect that Americans will do that for us, and I believe we need sometimes to do this exercise ourselves and to understand that US as our key security partner has also responsibilities in other parts of the world, and we should bring us closer in our strategic understanding what Washington needs to do. That's the first point, because it explains why we also need to take care about our relations with China, that we need substantive EU-US dialogue on China, for example, that we need to be active in Indo-Pacific, that EU and our partners need to understand this is a territory, this is a theater of global geopolitics right now. Second, we need to also understand the topics that will be important for Americans if we want to strengthen transatlantic cooperation. And here I believe there is a big scope for initiatives coming also from countries in Eastern Europe. And last but not least, we shouldn't wait for our partners to come up with the ideas. We need to be proactive. We need to contribute to the agenda. And as Bruno mentioned, it is not only about people-to-people contacts. I think it's also about strategic issues that we need to bring to the table and start deliberating with our partners. This is important for us. We are not bringing problems only. We are bringing solutions.
Thank you.
Joe Biden is an old-fashioned politician, and he definitely considers relationship with the European allies very important. That's a good starting point for our relationship. And just today, for example, the US has attributed recent attacks on Microsoft to China. So this is another example, whether we like it as Europeans or not, that China is coming to our table. We have to accept it, and we have to work together with the Americans, like Thomas said. For the EU nations, I think it's important to have a good balance on the relationship between EU and Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. I think we should encourage you to move forward in your reforms. What I think all three countries have done quite well in the last 10, 15 years. There have been periods where things have not gone that well, but generally what we see what has happened in 15 years in those three countries, it's a huge step forward. In the beginning of the 21st century, I think there were not many people in Europe that were expecting that in 2021 we are seriously discussing about EU membership of those three countries. So it's a huge step forward anyway, but a lot remains to be done. And third and finally, I think we should still be very careful to look what Russia is doing. I think the situation in this area has improved also quite a lot in the last 10 years. For example, the West was quite well prepared and talked relatively in united language when Russian exercises on the Ukrainian border started this spring. And I'm pretty sure that this is what was one of the reasons why President Putin decided not to escalate further. I think he had a plan to escalate, but the reactions were very clear, much more clear than in earlier situations, similar situations like that.
Thank you so much. Thomas?
Yes, the discussion is really great, and it's a pity that it's ending. So just to sum up, my thoughts. I think that it's also good to remember about this disinformation context when we are talking about protest. Like we mentioned, the protest in Georgia, the protests in Poland, which were happening some time ago. They were against government and pro rule of law, but as we mentioned today about protests in Georgia, in such situations there are influences from abroad, and everyone who understands national security knows this. So in our let's say message, we should just understand that it's not so easy as it seems sometimes, and we might be playing someone else's games using our own media outlets. So just one thing to remember. Second is really acknowledgement of a huge success stories of both of the three countries we are discussing, including Georgia, on their way toward building ties with Europe, European Union and NATO, and we should build on this, and we should, let's say, encourage them, not scourge them, not punish them for some small gaps in the democratic standard, but we should rather build on positive things that we achieved. And third thing would be adding some real improvements in our defense capabilities in NATO. I think we discussed that, for instance, something maybe not popular, but obligatory military training for young people. Is it something which is unbelievable right now? Because I think we should, in Estonia, you mentioned, I think, that there is something like this, right?
Yes, we have conscription, and we have had it for the last 30 years.
Yes, and I mean, it's not something which like a taboo we should omit. We are living in a dangerous world, and it's I think obvious that we should treat such initiatives seriously. Except, I mean, apart from talking about democracy but we should also talk about not only about soft security, but on tough security as well. And let me conclude by saying that also building democratic standards, we should not maybe exclude our tradition in Western Europe and Transatlantic zone. This tradition is Christianity. And I know it's not popular, not politically correct right now, but I'm trying to just mention this. Georgia was the second country which adopted Christianity after Armenia. And although there's many bad, let's say, practices and things to improve in every religion, we should not, let's say, exclude our background, our historic heritage of this kind, and we should just try to build it in a better way. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Richard.
The EU is doing a lot to support democratic reforms. They're doing a lot of it very, very well, but still, I think there's still scope to do more. I think reform processes in the three countries are at pivotal moments where they could be reinvigorated or they could go backwards. I think if they do move forward decisively over the next year or a couple of years, the EU should come forward with a really bold offer to include the states in CFSP or the European Economic Area, something really capable of making a difference on the ground. Then I think the EU should push the Biden administration to make sure the upcoming Democracy Summit really pays priority attention to this region and has some concrete follow-up to it, not simply a kind of summit declaration and then nothing happens, but that something happens and there's momentum that makes a difference on the ground. But I think overall, my observation would be that we all know that the attacks on democracy coming from outside powers are serious, they are pernicious, and they need to be dealt with. But we do need to remember that in the Eastern Partnership, in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe as well, democracy's main weaknesses are internal, and they need to be worked on and improved by internal actors with support across borders by all those that feel threatened by anti-democratic actions.
Thank you so much. Bruno.
Thanks. It's very short. I mean, look, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova have achieved a lot over the past years, and I think you should be very proud about that. So please do talk about those achievements assertively. Just also maybe to quote my former boss, Ronald Asmus, he was always telling me, Bruno, it's good to knock on the door, but sometimes you also need to kick the door open. So knocking is fine, but don't hesitate to kick as well. Sometimes that door has to open. But I think that Europe and NATO will be okay for kicking as long as the countries that we are talking about, the three countries, do one thing. It's reform, reform, reform. And that is not only a European policy point. We also see that the United States is now also moving this very high up on the policy agenda. So reform, reform, reform.
Thank you so much. And dear General, final word is yours.
First of all, thank you again for allowing this old military voice to come amongst all of these very learned colleagues, and I was happy to join this very well-spoken panel. I would just say that we enter into a time of opportunity and a time of challenge. On the security sense, I think we're in a time of opportunity. Russia has demonstrated enough bad behavior on the land around Ukraine, on the sea in the Ukrainian waters around Ukrainian Crimea, and then in cyberspace in all of our nations, that we should find now a shared sense of addressing this aggressive behavior, and so we should capitalize that. The challenge then comes in entangling economic arrangements. We saw how Russia used energy as a tool on Ukraine when they invaded Crimea, and then when they invaded the Donbass, and in two of the coldest winters in European history, used energy as a tool to affect the Ukrainian people. And now we see Europe becoming ever more reliant on Russian energy and what leverage that supplies into the future. And so I think opportunity in that we can find unity in defending against these aggressive behaviors, challenge in that we need as an alliance, as a transatlantic relationship, to really address some of the rising concerns about economic entanglements. And again, thank you all. What a great session this morning.
Thank you so much, dear General. And from my side, let me also add a few words. First of all, let me thank you all, our distinguished panelists, for your brilliant contribution and all the comments. And your support and your activities to support young democracies. From my side, let me say that we start our panel talking about our common security, and I mentioned that our common security is challenged and our common values are challenged. And when we are talking about values, this is the pillar of our statehood and security. We need to protect our values. I agree that Georgia is one of the oldest Christian country. However, I would say that this country with one of the oldest Christian tradition was challenged, and this oldest church was abolished in 1811 when first time when Russia annexed Georgia's territory and Georgia's statehood. And it's very important to remember that at that time Georgia is seeking protection and apply to the protection from the Christian country, lost its statehood and lost independence of its church. And today, when we are talking about Christianity, we have to bear in mind that since 2003, it's functioning joint working group between the Russian Patriarchate and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And if you look at the website of the Russia's MFA, you see how important are so-called family values. That's not actually the family values, so-called traditional values, how Russia portrayed that. Why I mentioned that we have to be very cautious when we're talking about our tradition, our values, and our principles, because we should know where religion starts and their policy starts, and not allowed to any single country use our traditions, even Christianity, against our statehood. That's why we need our cooperation, that's why we need EU, that's why we need NATO, and strength is in unity. So thank you so much. Let me thank our organizers, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Georgian government, participants, our technical staff for this conference despite of pandemic. I think we have very important discussion, and I'm looking forward to see you all in person, be it in Tbilisi or in Batumi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.